Hello and welcome to the lecture for the second part of section 1.1 through 1.5 in your textbook. I want to say a few more things about this particular slide that I ended section or part 1 on. So one of the things I want you to think about is the subject of convenience and how important that is for people. I think if you polled adults that you know in your life, they would most likely tell you that they have less free time than they've ever had before. If you think about a single parent that's taking children different places and trying to work full time and then maintain relationships with their family and all of those kinds of things, there's very little time left for other activities. And what that means is that how that impacts business, that's a type of external environment in which businesses operate. They operate in a culture in which people have very little free time. That means that businesses that offer convenience, that offer things to you more quickly, deliver things to your home, that they're going to be very successful, often more successful than businesses that don't offer that same kind of convenience. And we can kind of think for a minute about the impact that has on society in general. You have to look no further than the growth of Amazon, which you can sit on your couch and point at something on your iPad with your index finger, and the next day it's on your doorstep. You can't really be more convenient than that. But what has that meant to brick and mortar retailers, to stores that require people to get in their car, drive somewhere, park, and go in? That those businesses are suffering. And that long-term trend, if you kind of extend that to its natural conclusion, could very well mean that one day we might find ourselves in a place where we don't have brick and mortar retailers any longer. And would that be a good thing? The other thing I wanted to talk about is how social media has changed business. And I'd say it's changed business in one particular way that's very meaningful. And we'll talk about this later in the semester when we talk about marketing. And that's getting your message to existing and potential customers. So in the past, like when I first started my business, it was kind of a shotgun approach. You would put an ad in a magazine or something of that nature, and you would hope that the people that were looking at it would stop and read it. And you were exposing your message to a lot of people that weren't potential customers in the hope that there might be a few that would get it. What social media has done is allowed businesses to advertise through social media specifically to customers that have an interest in what it is that they're doing. So if I owned my playground company now and I was trying to target ads to elementary schools, I could place ads on anybody that follows a PTA group on Facebook as an example, and only those people would see my ad in their feed. So for me as an advertiser, that would mean that I'm getting more bang for my buck. My message is going directly to people that would potentially buy my product versus everybody. Another thing about the external environment is competitive influences. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about supply and demand in the next lecture. But it kind of operates this way. If there's a market or a product or a service that's being offered that's extremely profitable, somebody's making a lot of money doing that, that's going to attract more competition. More people are going to want a piece of that action. And as there's more competition, that's going to tend to bring prices down, which is going to erode that high profit. So there's kind of a natural correction in an unregulated market that would bring about lower prices and kind of mitigate that excessive profit that's being earned. So that's an important thing to think about. Where that starts to break down is if you have monopolies. So a monopoly could be in place with a patent on a particular product or service. It could be kind of a natural monopoly, or it could be a monopoly because somebody has gotten so big that it's hard for other small businesses to get in to the mix. So as an example, you told me that you had come up with an algorithm to make a better search engine than Google. How difficult would it be to displace Google as a search engine? That would be very, very difficult. So that raises questions about should there be limits on the size of companies, and there's arguments both ways on that. Another external influence is the global market. And it's in two ways. One is it offers American companies the opportunity to sell their products more broadly. I think there's approximately just under 8 billion people on the planet right now, 330 million in the US. So there's a lot more customers outside this country than there are inside. So being able to access those foreign markets and sell your products or your services other places is a huge opportunity for a lot of companies. It was for mine. The other side of that is the supply side. It also represents an opportunity for companies to buy products from low income countries where the wage rates are sometimes less than 10% of what they are here. So that allows companies to reduce their costs and either be more profitable or lower their prices. The majority of what you buy at Walmart comes from low wage countries. That's how they keep their prices low. And I think it's worth asking as a society, is that a good thing? Are those low prices worth it if it means that US factories close down? So that's, and I think it's interesting for you to consider whether or not you think about where something is made when you buy that. Does it influence your purchase decision, in other words? So another thing about the external environment is the influence of technology. And technology is defined as the application of science and engineering to solve production and organizational problems. So it can result in greater productivity. So a machine could take the place of people. It could make dangerous jobs less dangerous. It could make jobs that exert wear and tear on somebody's body easier to do for longer periods of time, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of good applications for technology in just about any company, but it also represents challenges. So it's a moment of flux where things are changing, and there are opportunities and there are the opposite of opportunities in that situation as well. One good example is self-driving cars. So that's starting to become an issue. A lot of people have cars that can drive themselves, and what does that mean for businesses that serve those particular customers? How aware do we need to be of what those opportunities might be if we have a business where people that drive in cars might be potential customers of ours? So it's just something interesting to consider. Productivity is defined as the output per hour of work. So if you can apply technology to create more output for an hour of labor, you're increasing productivity. So a little bit about basic economic systems of the world, and I won't go into too great a deal because you can read what's on these slides. I don't need to read it for you, but there are basically four different kinds of economic systems. There is capitalism, and in capitalism, the means of production or businesses are privately owned, and there's very little either government ownership of businesses directly or government involvement in business, interfering with them, that sort of thing. In communism, the government owns all or most enterprises. So if you work, you're working for the government, either directly or indirectly. So I would say that there are very few examples of either a pure capitalist society that has very, very little government involvement, and there's very few examples of communism, pure communism. There's really only two countries in the world that are still actually communist countries where the government owns everything. That's North Korea and Cuba. There's far more countries that have either socialism or some kind of mix of those things. So in socialism, industries that the government deems or society deems to be really critical, like transportation or the generation of electricity or providing health care, those kinds of things, the government says we can't allow these to be owned by private individuals. The government needs to own them, and the government needs to provide those services to its citizens so that we know that they're available to everybody and they're available at a reasonable cost, that excessive salaries or excessive profits don't cause the pricing of those services to be out of the reach of regular people. So examples of that would be Nordic countries, so Sweden, Denmark, those kinds of countries have very much an element of socialism to them. They have those kind of government ownership of those kinds of businesses, but they also have private businesses and entrepreneurs and those kinds of things. A mixed economy has private ownership of businesses, but government control of some. And again, there's more mixed economies than there is of any other kind. I would put the U.S. in a mixed economy. There is government ownership of some transportation, Amtrak as an example, bridges and those kinds of things. There's government ownership of the post office, of most education. So I would put us in the mixed economy category. So a little bit about worker incentives in capitalism. It's the profit motive. If you work harder, you will make more money and get bonuses and all of those kinds of things. That's the main incentive there. And management, businesses are managed by individuals with little interference. In communism, it's the opposite end of that scale. Whether you work hard or don't work hard, you're going to make a certain amount of money, period. So there isn't a lot of incentive to work harder, to put in extra time, to prepare yourself more for particular jobs, those kinds of things. So labor issues can be a problem in those countries. In socialism, it's similar to capitalism, that people get raises, those kinds of things. The one thing that's different is there is a more taxation in socialism. So there's less of a gap between the highest paid person in a company and the lowest paid person in the company when you look at it on an after-tax basis. So what they actually bring home at the end of the day, there's a much smaller gap there than there is, say, in the United States. And in a mixed economy, it's very similar to capitalism. So again, the forecast for 2020, this is a little bit dated, obviously it's pre-COVID, I'm sure. Capitalism would have continued steady growth, communism, very little growth and maybe backsliding, socialism, stable with a little bit of growth, and then continued growth in a mixed economy. And then there's examples of countries in all of those categories. A little bit about economics. So those of you that are going to be business majors will take Econ 201 and Econ 202. Macroeconomics, which is Econ 202, is the study of the entire economy. So how does the overall economy function? So subjects like inflation and unemployment and government spending and government debt and all of those kinds of things are covered under macroeconomics. Microeconomics, which is Accounting 201, is a study of individual choices by either people or companies. So what do we price our product at? What do we agree we'll purchase a product at what price, right? What kind of decisions do we make about the products we purchase? What kind of decisions do companies make about the products they'll produce? That's covered in microeconomics. And we'll talk more about that in the next lecture when we talk about supply and demand. So one of the ways to look at the economy is a big circular flow of inputs and outputs. So that's shown by this graphic that I took from the textbook there. So there are resource markets. There are resources like wages, natural resources, all of that. Those are inputs to businesses for making products. So resource markets will sell resources to companies that make products. Companies will make products for households. They'll get money from those households. People will be employed in those households, which will give them money that they can in turn buy goods and services from companies. The government takes a share of that income, which allows them to fix roads and build bridges and have the military so we're protected from outside harm. All of those kinds of things are funded by the federal government, and which relies on taking a portion of this entire economy. So think about that kind of mutually dependent system where one aspect affects the other. A little bit about macroeconomic goals. So countries want to have economic growth. Economic growth means the economy is growing larger. There is more opportunities for people, a higher standard of living for people. Economic growth is measured by the gross domestic product, or GDP. The GDP is the measure of all of the goods and services that are produced by a country in a year. So that's how we measure which economy is the biggest. Right now, we are generally considered to have the biggest economy, but China is very close and is growing faster than us. So we will probably have the second biggest economy at some point in the future. A recession is when we have 2 quarters or 3-month periods in a row where GDP contracts, where it shrinks. A recovery, of course, is when we start seeing growth after a recession. A depression, which thankfully none of us have lived through, is a very severe, prolonged recession. And again, you get into that kind of death spiral where businesses aren't selling as much, they lay people off. The people that are laid off have less money, so they have less money to buy products and services from businesses, which decrease their sales further. So you get into this kind of spiral that often requires government involvement to pull out of it. The other thing they talk about is wanting full employment. Now, full employment doesn't mean 100% of the people that are looking for jobs have a job. There's always going to be some level of frictional unemployment. That's the unemployment that exists when people are changing jobs. And so you want some of that. Some of that exists in a healthy economy. Structural unemployment is when the economy changes. Let's say, as an example, in 5 or 10 years, the government decides that because of global warming that we can't have coal burning any longer, that that's not acceptable. There's about 60,000 people in the country that mine coal for a living. All of those people would lose their jobs. That's structural unemployment. That's something changing the economy where we don't need that anymore, and now there's new jobs. And that represents a real challenge because it's difficult to take somebody who's mined coal their whole life and is in their 50s and teach them to be a computer programmer, as an example. Cyclical unemployment is the unemployment that's connected to the cycle of recessions and recoveries. So as the economy shrinks, there's greater unemployment due to that reason, but it generally comes back when the economy picks up. And then seasonal unemployment is just what it sounds like. There's less employment in the retail sector when it's not a holiday period, that sort of thing. Inflation is the goal of the country is to have low inflation, have prices not increasing dramatically. That's measured by the Consumer Price Index. That's a measure of a basket of goods that every typical family purchases. Every typical family purchases food. They purchase gasoline for their car. They purchase rent or a mortgage payment. They purchase some kind of healthcare services. They purchase some clothing. They purchase a telephone or telephone services, all of that. So there is a branch of the government that measures all of that, measures it by different localities so they can say what the cost of living is in San Francisco versus Lincoln, Nebraska. So high inflation, prices rising quickly, negatively impacts purchasing power. That's happening right now. Inflation was 7% this past year. That's the highest it's been in 20 years. It especially affects people that are living on a fixed income. If you're collecting $2,000 a month from a pension, then that $2,000 doesn't buy you as much if prices go up. So that's the end of the lecture for the second part of this first section in the text, and I look forward to talking to you for the next lecture. Thank you.